Morning. At around 3 o'clock last Monday morning, I drove into the city and joined a group of Liverpool football supporters and over 10 million people around the world to watch Liverpool win the English Premier League. In the 34th minute of the match, a player called Cody Gakpo scored a goal for Liverpool. And in celebration, he ran towards the crowd behind the goal, and in front of 60,000 people in the stadium, millions of people around the world, and a group of us gathered together at Sky City, he lifted his shirt off over his head and he sent this message to the world. It was a pretty special moment. Not everybody around me greeted that message with the same glee that I did, but it didn't matter. I think they got the message anyway. In some ways, too, that message speaks into what we're going to be looking at this morning. Around 5,000 years ago, humans began to replace the bartering of goods with more standardized forms of exchange. And the idea was to use items whose value could be authenticated and which were portable. Initially, these took the form of pieces of metal such as silver or gold, whose value would be determined by their weight. And these were called shekels, after the Hebrew word for weigh. And over time, the silver shekel became the standard currency of the ancient world. During the reign of King David, the shekel began to be minted with inscriptions and images, including depictions of royal symbols. But it wasn't until several centuries later that the first coins, as we would recognise them now, began to appear. And the earliest coins that we found from the ancient world have been taken from the temple of Artemis in Ephesus, and these date back to around the 8th century before Christ. One example is the Lydian lion, which was the first coin issued by any government in history. The Lydian lion is made of an alloy called electrum, which was a mixture of gold and silver. And the stamp of the royal lion was a guarantee of the value of the metal content to those who wanted to use the coin for trade or gifts and so on. Over time, production of coinage became increasingly sophisticated, and the uses of coins developed beyond simply units of exchange. Coinage became instruments of political control through the levying of taxes and by governments restricting the production and circulation of money. And coins carried historical and cultural messages. The denarius was a silver coin that featured the image of the current emperor. It was a reminder of Roman political power and a symbol of the reach of the empire. Remember when Jesus was asked about paying taxes to Caesar? It was a denarius that Jesus held up and he said, "Give back to Caesar that which is Caesar's and to God that which is God's." Another coin in circulation in New Testament times was the Tyrian shekel. This shekel was also a silver coin. It became the official currency for payment of the half-shekel annual temple tax. In Matthew 17, Peter's asked by the tax collectors whether Jesus is paying his temple taxes. And when Peter asks Jesus about this, Jesus tells him to go to the lake and throw out a line. And he says the first fish that Peter catches will have a silver coin in its mouth. That silver coin was a Tyrian shekel. It was exactly the amount needed to pay the tax for both Peter and Jesus. Interestingly, 30 shekels was the amount paid to a master as compensation if his slave died while he was working. And it's also the amount, the 30 pieces of silver paid by the chief priests to Judas for betraying Jesus. But the coin at the centre of our message this morning has none of the grandeur or notoriety of the denarius or the shekel. This coin was small and rough. It was cheaply made with plain and simple imagery. And unlike the gold and silver coins used by the Roman elite, this coin was for the common people. It was a currency for those at the bottom of the economic ladder. This coin was called a lepton, a Greek word that means thin or small. They were made of bronze and were the smallest value denomination of any currency of the ancient world. And to illustrate just how small, it cost roughly 15 of these leptons just to buy a small loaf of bread. When the King James Version of the Bible was written, the authors translated the Greek word lepton into the Latin word minutum. And minutum was then translated into the English word for crumb, which was the word mite. And so we have the story of the widow's mite. I got there in the end, right? Can you go with me, please, to Mark chapter 12? As we read through this chapter, we get the sense of how much Jesus was in conflict with what we would call today the local elite. Wherever Jesus teaches, he seems to be followed by the Pharisees and Sadducees, who are all trying to trap Jesus in saying something that they could use against him. In verse 35, Mark tells us that Jesus is teaching in an area of the temple courts, and the temple complex housed several courtyards, each with specific functions and restrictions. And most likely Jesus was in the court of Gentiles. This was a part of the temple complex was accessible to all, Jew and Gentile. And in verse 38, Jesus delivers a stinging rebuke of the teachers of the law. These teachers were also known as scribes, and they held considerable influence over Jewish life. The scribes were experts in the Mosaic law. They interpreted and taught the law, not only for religious instruction, but also for civil and legal matters within the Jewish ruling council. And from verse 38, Jesus says this: "Watch out for the teachers of the law. They like to walk around in flowing robes and be greeted with respect in the marketplaces and have the most important seats in the synagogues and places of honor at banquets. They devour widows' houses and for a show make lengthy prayers. These men will be punished most severely." It's important to remember that these teachers were among the leaders of the nation. They had power and influence, and Jesus is saying here that the splendor of their robes, their long prayers, and their seating places of authority in public life are simply a show to hide their hypocrisy. Part of the role of scribes was the writing of wills and conducting the legal requirements around the transfer of property, and the system was known to be corrupt. Scribes would abuse their influence over vulnerable people, particularly widows, to exploit them financially and remove their means of supporting their families. And Jesus then moves out of the court of Gentiles and through a 20-metre wide gate called the Gate Beautiful, or the Susan Gate. This was made of Corinthian bronze, and it contained a magnificent sculptured relief of the city of Susa in ancient Persia. I'm going to be spending a little bit of time talking about aspects of the temple, and it'll all come together toward the end. Through this gate, Jesus would have entered into the next temple court that housed the treasury. This area was surrounded by colonnades, which were corridors formed into a long sequence of columns. Along the walls, there were 13 treasury chests. 2 of these were for the temple tax, and the rest were for voluntary offerings that went towards the work of the priests and to support the poor. Each chest had a kind of funnel coming out of the top that was made of bronze and shaped like a trumpet. The people would place their contributions through the funnel and into the box below. Let's pick the story up from verse 41. Jesus sat down opposite the place where the offerings were put and watched the crowd putting their money into the temple treasury. Many rich people threw in large amounts, but a poor widow came and put in 2 very small copper coins worth only a few cents. Calling his disciples to him, Jesus said, "Truly, I tell you, this poor widow has put more into the treasury than all the others. They all gave out of their wealth, but she, out of her poverty, put in everything, all she had to live on." In the hours preceding this, Jesus has been engaged in a prolonged period of ministry at the temple. He's been teaching to crowds of people. The Jewish religious leaders have been relentless in trying to trap him in controversy. And Mark quietly reminds us of Jesus' humanity. After the physical and emotional exertions of the day, Jesus sits down to find rest. And he chooses a place opposite where the offerings were given. And he begins to watch the crowds as they move across the courtyard. But this isn't just a casual observation. Jesus is looking into the hearts of each giver. He's observing their motives and he's weighing up their true intentions. Verse 41 speaks of a crowd of people, many of whom are rich. We can imagine a line of people queuing up to give their contributions, some possibly well-intentioned, others no doubt making a very public display of their wealth and the generosity of their giving. Throughout the Bible, there are a number of times when people play a significant role in the narrative and yet retain relative obscurity. Mark tells us here of an unnamed woman, a widow, who's visiting the temple to give her offering. And in a very few words, Mark paints a powerful contrast between her and others who have gathered in and around that courtyard. Many would have been there simply to contribute their temple tax, which was a compulsory contribution toward the running of the temple. However, widows were exempt from the tax, and so we know this woman was there to give her gift entirely out of her own free will. And then there's the irony and the idea that her offering could have gone to support the poor. Mark tells us that this woman was the poor, and in a way that would have set her apart from almost everyone else in that courtyard. The Greek word that's translated poor here and in verse 43 comes from a word that means to crouch or to cringe or to cower. The word was used of beggars who were reduced to total destitution, crouched in a corner with one hand out while the other hand actually covered their face from shame. And Mark also talks of the difference in the way people gave. In verse 41, when he refers to the rich, the words translated put and through imply a deliberate intention to create a loud noise as the coins land in the bronze funnels and tumble into the offering boxes beneath. To use an old-fashioned word, this sounds like an ostentatious show of wealth and a false piety that Jesus had already called out in the teachers of the law. But in verse 42, Mark describes the way the widow places her gift, and he uses a different word in a very different tense, a word that has the meaning of a far more passive, a more restrained and deliberate action. There's no show, there's no celebration, there's just a quiet and unassuming humility. The rich gave out of their wealth, literally out of what was overflowing to them. But this widow had just 2 near worthless coins. And these coins were all she owned. It was everything she had to live on, and yet she gave them both. And in response, Jesus calls his disciples together. The word call has a meaning of not just kind of like come here. It means to summon. It means to bring together in a particular place. No doubt the disciples were scattered around the temple courts. Most of them probably wouldn't be paying any attention at all to this woman. But Jesus was watching. He begins by speaking into the contrast between the fragile state of this woman and that of the wealthy. And then he says that although her gift is literally less than the others, he assesses it as more. And not just more than any of the others, more than all of the others combined. Her gift had somehow resonated louder and sweeter to Jesus than all the other gifts put together because he sees into her heart. He sees her motives, her true intentions. Jesus is saying that the spirit of giving determined the value of the gift, not the amount of the giving. And he also seems to say that the value of gift is determined to some extent by what it costs the giver. She gave everything. All she had to live on. You know, God doesn't need our money. He doesn't need our skills and talents and time. But when we give to him willingly and sacrificially, then God is pleased and God is honoured. The temple precinct in which all this played out was truly magnificent. The temple courts had been the centre of Jewish life for centuries. And the wider area of the Temple Mount had been almost doubled in size by King Herod a decade or so before the birth of Christ. This picture is an artist's impression of the inner temple courts. The taller building is the temple itself with its marble walls and golden points and gates. In the foreground you can see the place where all of this had played out with its colonnades and the temple treasury. Then if we zoom out, this next picture shows us the entire Temple Mount, how it would have looked. I'm sorry, it's small and a bit blurry, just bear with me. At the top right is a brownish roof, the top right. That was the pinnacle of the temple. It sits at a height roughly the same as a 45-story building. And this is thought to be the place where Satan tempted Jesus to throw himself down to the ground below. The longer walls of the temple area were roughly the length of 5 football fields, and the temple itself stood close to 15 stories high. As Jesus was leaving the area of the temple courts, some of the disciples commented about the beauty of the temple itself, how it was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. And you know, this angers Jesus. The temple had become for many an idol, to mean more to the people than God himself. The building had been turned into a marketplace. It hosted the excesses of religious hypocrisy. And so Jesus' response is this: as for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another. Every one of them will be thrown down. And just a few decades later, in 70 AD, the armies of the Roman Empire laid siege to the city of Jerusalem. And over months of fighting and untold death and destruction, they broke through the fortified networks of the city. They tore down the northern colonnades of the complex itself and left the temple a smouldering ruin. Folks, the problem was not the temple. The problem was the people in the temple. They'd lost the sense of relationship with God. Their religion had become ritual, an expression of form over substance, and they no longer had a heart for God. But in that place, the actions of one woman, who the crowds would not have given a second thought, point us to the place where the temple really dwells, and that's in our hearts. At the bottom of the image on the screen, in the centre of the picture, and just outside the city wall, you'll see a plain-looking hill that's dwarfed by the size and the scale of its surroundings. That hill is Calvary. And in the story of contrasts, this is the greatest of all, because nothing that ever happened inside the temple grounds rivaled what happened on that hill. Nothing in the amazing temple structures, not the marble nor the gold, rivaled the beauty of what took place there. At Calvary, Jesus gave everything for you and for me. And if we truly belong to him, we should hold nothing back from him. And in this sense, the story of the widow's mite is not about money. It's about motivation. It's about what's in here. It's about how much of ourselves we're prepared to give to him. For these coins to have had any worth to this widow, who truly must have had virtually nothing, and yet she loved God enough. She loved him so much. She trusted him enough to give everything she had. 3,000 years ago, God sent a prophet to the home of a sheep farmer who lived in a town a few miles from Jerusalem. He told the prophet to anoint one of the farmer's sons as the next king of Israel. And as the prophet met each of the sons in turn, God rejected one after the other, until he came to the youngest, a young boy named David. The words with which God guided that prophet are these: the Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Folks, God has given differently to each of us, but it's not what he's given us. It's what we do with what he's given us. In the busyness of that temple court 2,000 years ago, 2 thin bronze coins meant more to Jesus than all the gold and silver put together, because they were given from the heart. The gift represented the very essence of the giver. And so when we choose what we value, when we choose how we use what God has given to us, let's remember that he is either Lord of all or he is not Lord at all. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for the people in your word who sometimes come to us with relative obscurity or total obscurity. I thank you for how much we have to learn from them. And Father, I pray that we will put that into practice, that the joy of our heart will be serving you. The joy of our heart will be giving back to you the things that you've given to us. Whatever they are, however insignificant we may think they are, you delight, you find joy in the generosity of our giving. Father, I thank you for this time this morning as we've opened your word. You always teach us, and it is precious to us. In Jesus' name, amen.